Hi, and welcome to Getting Started with Azure Active Directory Insights and Reporting. I'm Sarah Baranowski, and I'm here today with my colleague, Ben Seiler. We're both PMs in the Identity Division at Microsoft, and we're going to be sharing a little bit about using log data in Azure Active Directory today. So let's get started. So today's agenda, we'll be looking at how to use Azure Active Directory logs and building reporting and analytics into Azure. We'll look at some common options for integrating with SIEM tools and gathering and sharing insights. Finally, we're going to look at adding these insights to workbooks in Azure. We'll get started with an introduction to Azure Active Directory logs. As part of that, we'll be looking at common scenarios that require sign-in and audit logs, the difference between sign-in and audit events, documentation and resources to get you started, as well as options for accessing and analyzing the logs. We'll be going through a demo of that a little bit later. So first up, some learning resources. Before you get started, you might want to do some planning. There's a great resource on that in docs.microsoft.com that I reference at the top of this list. There's also some documentation available on Azure Monitor, MS Graph, running log queries. We're going to look at a few examples of that later today, as well as Azure AD workbooks. And finally, if you do have questions after this talk, I'd encourage you to go out and post them to our tech community. And I've included the URL for that tech community there at the bottom of the slide. So before we get into the demo, let me walk through a little bit about Azure Active Directory. Reporting in Azure Active Directory consists of activity reporting, which includes the things that users and admins do in their tenant, and also security reporting, which is flags for risky users or risky sign-ins. Today, we're going to be focused on the activity reporting portion. And that activity reporting consists of both sign-in logs and audit logs. Sign-in logs happen every time a user signs in and a token is issued. Audit logs happen every time a change is made. To a tenant. So, for example, managing users in groups, applications, making changes to your directory. Azure Active Directory records all these activities and surfaces them to a few specific privileged roles. Those include global administrators and security administrators, as well as some reader roles: security readers, global readers, and report readers. Now, only users in these roles can access all of the logs, although individual users can access their own sign-ins. So first up, why worry about activity reporting? You might want to monitor for specific events, conduct security investigations. That's one very common case scenario. For example, to trace a potential bad actor. You might need to do compliance reporting, and ensure policies are being applied and enforced. You also might want to store your activity logs for later use, for some required retention period, particularly if you're in an industry that requires that you retain data for a certain period of time. So as we get into our demo, do keep in mind that most of what we'll be demonstrating today requires an Azure AD Premium P1 or P2 license. So let's dive into the demo. So first up, here we are in the Azure portal, and I'm going to go ahead and click into Azure Active Directory, which is where we'll spend most of our time today. So here in the Azure portal, we're going to go ahead and navigate down to the monitoring section in Azure Active Directory and look at sign-ins and audit logs. This is where you access from the UI the log data. I'm going to go ahead and select sign-ins. And we'll do a little bit of a review about the navigation here. So first of all, you might want to expand your time horizon just to have more data to work with. We'll look at the last month. And then we'll go ahead and add, we can add some filters. So for example, we might want to add a user filter. and look for a particular user. You'll also notice that you can always download these records. You can add columns. Not all of the columns are displayed by default. So we might want to hide or display certain of the fields. And we might want to do a little bit of additional filtering. So as we're looking at this, for example, I might want to drill in and expand and take a closer look at a particular one of these records. Or I might want to add an additional filter to see if we can find a problem spot. So for example, status, let's look for failures and go ahead and run that filter. And what will happen next is we'll see just the filters for our user, Betty Bartholomew. And here there's only one record, so it displays in the expanded view right off the bat. You can also collapse that down and narrow it down just to this one particular case. Next up, audit logs show up right under sign-in logs under monitoring. The navigation here is very similar to sign-in logs, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it works. Just know that it works very similar to the way sign-ins do. Now let's take a look at some of the work that our dev team is doing to enable some more at-a-glance reporting. Most of what we're going to be looking at today involves you digging into the records yourself so that you can run your own queries and build your own reports. But our dev team does work on building more at-a-glance views of this data, and this is just one example of those that is in preview mode, and I'd like to provide a sneak peek. So going into usage and insights, you'll see authentication methods activity here. And when we look at this, we get a nice, clean, tiled view of the different ways that users are accessing our tenant. And here, for example, we might be in a situation where we want to dig into multi-factor authentication. Perhaps this is an area we're trying to beef up. And so we can see that we've got some work to do in the MFA department here. So I can then click in and see more details that are specific to our progress in migrating to MFA. So for example, I might want to look at the not registered cases. And I'll go ahead and apply that filter. And then we've narrowed ourselves down to the specific users who we need to target. So now that we've looked at accessing the log data in the Azure Portal UI, let's take a look at MS Graph. Here we are in Graph Explorer. I've just moved over to a different tab. And I'm already signed in as our fictional administrator, Timothy Perkins. But if you're not signed in, you'll have to go ahead and do that. And then you can start taking a look at what different ways you have of programmatically accessing the log data through MS Graph. So I'm going to share a few examples of that today. So just taking a look at the first case, we'll go ahead with audit logs, WAC sign-ins, just to demonstrate the sign-in data. This can take a minute or so to run. And we'll pause and wait for it to run. While it's formatting here, I will also mention that you can go into the Code Snippets tab to take a look at the different syntax examples in a few languages that you might like to work in. Go back to the response preview. This will give you a sense of the kinds of records and the formatting of the records that will be returned when you do your calls. You can work in the programming environment and language of your choice, and then use the Explorer here to get a sense of the kind of data that will be returned. So here you see some example records. I'll also share directory audits. That's another case. We'll go ahead and run that query. One thing to mention here while this is loading is that you will, if you haven't done this before, you may need to go ahead and modify permissions. So here you'll notice that if I scroll over, you'll see that my status is all consented. I've gone ahead and done that in advance of this demo. However, if you haven't already done so, you'll need to click a consent button here under status in order to have the capability to run this query. So again, we see our results, and then I'm going to share an example of a specific filter that we can apply. It's just one example. Narrow that down, and I'll run that query. So now, because in our filter, you notice that we narrowed down to user management, here we can see that all of our records returned fall under the category user management. So that's our filter. Moving back over to the Azure portal, we'll look at the final option that we're going to review today for accessing the log data, and that's log analytics. Log analytics is the main tool in the Azure portal for querying and analyzing log data. And even if you plan on using that log query somewhere else in Azure Monitor, you would typically start by writing and testing the query in log analytics. It's a great place to do your query writing, test it out, and make sure that it's returning the results that you expect, as well as for doing some ad hoc data exploration. So I'm going to expand I'm going to get back into our home landing base for Azure Active Directory. And here we've got our left nav bar. We'll scroll back down here. And now we're going to move into diagnostic settings. Before you can start working in log analytics, you'll need to get your diagnostic settings set up in order to start streaming the data in. So that's the step we're doing here today. We go ahead and, now I've set this up in advance, so I'm not actually going to create a new setting. I already have done that here. But just to share the screen with you and the method, you go ahead and select both audit logs and sign-in logs, and then you can select to send to log analytics here. You'll notice that you also have the option to share to a storage account or stream to an event hub. Those are also available options, and we'll look at those a little later. For right now, we're just going to be sending to log analytics in order to run queries there. I will go ahead and discard this example because we've already set this up elsewhere. But now that we've enabled those settings, now we have the option to go into logs, which is also under the monitoring section. So we'll click there and start running queries. It takes about 15 minutes for your log data to start streaming in. So do keep that in mind. Maybe run and get a coffee or something before you get started. After you've started flowing the data in, it'll just take a little while to get it going. So now that we're here in logs, I'm going to share a few examples. You'll notice here in the, let me expand this out a little bit. There we go, have a little more screen real estate to work with. You'll notice that here in the under log management, there's several different tables that are enabled here. Sign-in logs and audit logs are the ones that that we're going to be working with and that we started streaming in. I've already favorited them here, so they show up at the top. Now, before we run our first query, I am going to set the time range to a little longer so we have more to work with. And then I'm going to go ahead and show an example query. There we go. Let's run that. And right off the bat, you can see with a fairly simple query, we're able to start looking at the amount, the volume of sign-ins. Now let's look at a few other examples. First off, we'll look at here's, kind of gives you a sense of the categories, the services under each category, and the specific operation names. Is a nice place to start when you're exploring the data to get a sense of what's included in the schema. And then we'll maybe get into specific success and failure example. So I'm going to go ahead and run that as just a starting point. We see we've got in our audit logs, we have our successes and failures counted. And I've got some sample filters included in this query. I'm going to just show them as an example of how you can do some exploration of the data. So here we see that we've got failures are mainly falling under application management. Look at another way of slicing, see if we can kind of get to the bottom of what's going on. Now we see under account provisioning. And then finally, let's take a look at operation name. Here we see some patterns starting to emerge. Okay, export, process escrow. So that looks like something I want to drill into further and maybe visualize or do more with. So here we're going to take a look at the data. Let's see if we can create some more screen real estate here. So we have a specific visualization, and then we're going to do some filtering and just look for failures. And here we see the same process, or rather the same categories, export and process escrow, highlighted in our bar chart. So that's the end of that demo. Now we're going to get into some more extended reporting scenarios. So first off, monitoring and SIEM integrations. First, we're going to look at Azure Monitor and Log Analytics. We'll get into the SIEM integrations, particularly Azure Sentinel is one of those options, and we'll also look at some third-party SIEM tools and how we would integrate with those. Let's start with Azure Monitor. Our goal with Azure Monitor is to provide end-to-end monitoring of your application. To accomplish that, we provide a common back-end platform that's built across Azure. So what that means to you is near real-time, out-of-the-box monitoring of all collected data consolidated into one single platform. So what we can then do with the data is provide end-to-end insights. Whether you have a problem with your application code or a VM that it's deployed to or the underlying network, you get a bird's eye view and drill downs that help you isolate the problem faster and then quickly fix issues in your modern cloud application. This slide here provides another look at how Azure Monitor works at a high level. You'll notice that data flows in to Azure Monitor through specific applications and Azure Platform Services. Identity data through Azure Active Directory is one of those, and then flows into Azure Monitor. And then you'll notice also the integration with SIEM tools, with visualization tools of your choice, including Power BI, which is one of the questions that we'll get sometimes, as well as dev tools and other places where the data might be most relevant and actionable to you. Before we get into the demo of Azure Monitor, first off, let's look at some prerequisites. You'll need to have an Azure subscription, an Azure Active Directory tenant, and a user with global administrator or security administrator privileges. A log analytics workspace is also going to be required within your Azure subscription. Once you've set up those prerequisites, you'll also then be able to start working with the queries that we looked at earlier in log analytics. You'll have a central analytics platform that spans across monitoring, management, and security. And you'll be able to run queries for investigations, run statistics, do root cause analysis, and that sort of thing. And that's all available from within the Azure portal. As we looked at earlier, queries allow you to do your own kind of exploration of the data. But in addition to that, Azure Monitor includes machine learning algorithms for clustering and anomaly detection. Also allows you to set up custom alerts and actions that will get you acting on the data in a more automated and operationalized fashion. Also provides you some specific dashboard views to help you get started. Additionally, as mentioned earlier, SIEM integrations become a possibility as well. Azure Sentinel is one specific SIEM tool that's available from directly within Azure. But in addition to Sentinel, we also enable integrations with Splunk, Sumo Logic, and ArcSight. So common SIEM tools that you might use to get a bird's eye view across all of your systems end to end and get all the data in one place where you can take action on it. So now let's get into a demo. First up, let's build an activity run chart and add it to our dashboard. So I'm going to flip back over to the Azure portal. And here we are again within Log Analytics. And I'm going to run one more query. Here we go. So here we have some results. Now I'm going to switch right over to the chart tab. Because this is showing as a bar chart and this is actually a time series, I'm going to go ahead and make a formatting change. Make that a line chart. And now we have a nice formatted chart to work with. We can go ahead and save that if we would like to come back to it later. We can also export the data. And you can export as a CSV, but you can also export directly to Power BI. So if you're looking for visualizations in Power BI, this is your option. And additionally, we can pin to a dashboard. Azure comes with dashboard capabilities so that you can pin visualizations as you develop them and refer back to them over time. So let's go ahead and do that. I will select my dashboard and go ahead with that now. It takes a minute for it to load, and then once it's pinned, I can go ahead and click into my dashboard and get a look at what we've just done. So here you'll see a visual that I added earlier. Shrink that down a little bit. And now you'll see I'm starting to work in the editor We'll scroll over here and we can start making some changes. So perhaps we'd like to change the name of the title to something a little more descriptive. Let's see here, perhaps we can stick with the audit logs theme, but our subtitle we can say count of operations. We can also expand this. And then once we are comfortable with, how we want things to look and ready to finalize changes, publish changes. And that's that. All right. So now once logs are enabled, we can also set up some alerts. So why don't we head over to Azure Monitor and get started with that. I'll search for Azure Monitor. Navigate over there, then I'll select alerts. We're going to manage alert rules. Now you'll see that there are already several alerts created. A typical well-managed tenant will have more than just this small handful, but these should give you a pretty good idea. Why don't we click into Add User to get a sense of what's under the hood. You'll notice that a specific condition is set with a specific threshold, and there's some estimated costs provided here as well for your planning purposes. And so once you've gotten your alerts set up and the right kind of threshold built in, then you can go ahead and save it. And it will start to provide you with notifications. There's also some alert rules in here about how to send email and the specifics of how you want to be alerted. All right, now next we have the SIEM integrations that I mentioned earlier. If you use a security information and event management system or SIEM tool, then you might want to bring your Azure AD logs into that common environment for complete end-to-end security monitoring of your cloud infrastructure. Azure provides a SIEM solution called Azure Sentinel, as I mentioned a moment ago, and we're going to look at that next. And then in addition to that, you can also integrate Azure AD activity logs into the other common SIEM solutions that I mentioned earlier. Wherever you choose to do your end-to-end threat monitoring and incident response, you can bring your Azure AD log data in so that you can really see an end-to-end view. So here's how to get started. I'm going to navigate back to Azure Active Directory. And then again, go to the diagnostic settings where we were earlier. And then we will click Edit Setting in one of these existing settings that I already set up. Here you'll see this is where we're flowing audit log data in. And then I'm going to go ahead and stream to an event hub. This will be needed for the SIEM tool integration. So once I've done that, I'll save and do the same thing in the setting I'm using to manage my sign-in log data. Again, stream to Event Hub, save. And there we are. So now that this data is flowing in, you'll be able to integrate with the SIEM tool of your choice. I'm going to head over to Azure Sentinel. and share a little bit about integrating with that particular SIEM tool, which is built right into Azure. Azure Sentinel allows you to collect all of your security data in one place where you can then detect, investigate, and respond to potential security threats and issues. If you're looking to bring your Azure AD log data together with other logs and service telemetry for complete end-to-end monitoring and management, that's a good place to do it. So first of all, I'm going to navigate to Sentinel, which I can do in the search bar. You might need to set up a workspace first. That's already done here, so I can skip that step. So I'm going to go ahead and click on it. And then under Configuration, I'm going to click Data Connectors. So here, a variety of connectors are provided. I'm going to select Azure Active Directory and open that connector page. You'll notice these two checkboxes are already selected. If they weren't, they should be. And then you select over to Next Steps. And for this particular demo, I'm going to select Azure AD Sign-In Logs, where there's a couple template options provided. I will try this one, the Azure AD Sign-In Logs option. Now here you'll notice that if it's already a template you want to use, you can go ahead and save it and then start making modifications to it so that it, you can add to it, subtract from it, and make changes as you need to. But if you're not sure yet, before you save, you might want to view the template, and I'm going to do that now so we can get a look at what's in there. So here we get a look at the template. You'll notice that it provides, in this particular case, because it's related to the sign-in logs and it's a template for monitoring sign-ins, provides a bunch of at-a-glance looks at specific sign-in events, successes, failures, users who are logging in, locations, and so forth. And this is just one example, lots of templates available. This just gives you one example. And you'll notice this is here in Workbooks. So if you go ahead and save this, it will become a workbook that you can start working with. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Ben Seiler, who will walk you through more about workbooks in Azure.
Thanks, Sarah. Workbooks within Azure AD are an easy way for you to visualize data and take a quick look at some of the information that Sarah has already shared. These workbooks are built on top of the queries and the data sources that Sarah has detailed in this talk. And the really great thing about them is they're a great way for you to take quick looks at repeatable problems, common issues that people have in their identity and access management estates. So a great way for you to just see what's happening in your tenant at any time. They include a bunch of pre-built templates that allow you to solve for common issues. These include things like your general sign-in health, how well users are doing at getting access to their resources, as well as the end user experience with things like conditional access, making sure that you're not locking out any end users, and then some security related things as well, such as tracking legacy authentication methods or other less secure sign-in methods, or just seeing in general what's happening in your tenant. As you get more familiar with workbooks, you can clone and edit existing workbooks so that you can make sure that they fit exactly what your needs are for the processes that your organization runs or for your goals for this quarter or for this half. And once you get really advanced, you are welcome to contribute to our workbook population by sharing your workbook with other Azure AD users. So before you can get started with workbooks, what are the steps that you need to take? As with many of the other features that we've shared, you do need to have premium licensing. So that's either P1 or P2 licenses associated with your tenant. So just be aware of that. You'll also need access to a log analytics workspace. So there are instructions online about how to set that up. And then you'll need an appropriate role so that you can access these workbooks within Azure AD. We've listed out the roles that have access to workbooks, and I would recommend report reader or security reader so that you don't have to be overprivileged as a more powerful admin just to access these workbooks. All right, so covering those prerequisites, how do you get started with workbooks? So the first step, and this is applicable to basically any organization, is just to explore the default workbooks. We provide quite a few defaults, and these are our workbooks that are aimed at helping solve common problems that many organizations have, such as just tracking in general what's happening with your sign-ins or seeing what's happening with your conditional access policies. So the best way to get started is just to start clicking around and see what you can see through the workbooks that are available. Once you're familiar with the default workbooks, a great second step is to edit them and optimize the queries so that they make sense for your organization. You'll likely have some things that are a little bit different in the way that you run your Azure AD instance, and so you can update the workbooks to make sure that they work exactly for the metrics that you're interested in and want to track. As you get more advanced, you can build new workbooks, and these can be very helpful for help desk staff or other admins within your business to help them automate and repeatedly look up issues with help desk users or other common issues that you run into. And last, if you get very comfortable with workbooks and would like to share some of your built workbooks with other users, we have a GitHub where you can contribute and help other Azure AD customers understand more about what's happening in their identity and access management system. So today we'll take a look in the demo at a couple of common workbooks. We'll look at the sign-in analysis workbook, which is really great for just understanding in general what's happening in your tenant. We will look at sign-ins using conditional access to see what's happening with conditional access and whether you might be accidentally blocking users that you don't intend to. And then we'll also take a look at sign-in failures, which is really useful for just making sure after you change policies that your user experience doesn't degrade and that people are not getting locked out from resources they should have access to. All right, so with that, let's swap over to the demo. All right, so to begin our demo, this is the workbooks blade within the Azure AD instance, the same test instance that Sarah was using. So you can navigate here from within Azure Active Directory in the Azure portal. And here you can see all of the default workbooks that we provide to all Azure AD customers. So first of all, let's take a look at this sign-ins workbook. This workbook is really great for just understanding your general sign-in health. It's a good way to keep track of what's happening in your tenant. So let's take a quick tour. First, there are some filters up here at the top that apply to the whole report. If you're investigating just a certain time frame or application, you can click through here and see just the activity that you're interested in. This is also a good place for checking on activity of newly rolled out apps or important apps. You can also change the time range here. So if you're investigating a specific incident or if you want to see a longer period, both of those are available to you. This does look at all of the sign-in log info that Sarah showed earlier, so this query can take a little bit of time to run, especially if you have a large tenant with hundreds of thousands of users. So I've switched to 30 days here, and we can see my sign-in patterns over those 30 days on these trend lines. We see that the vast majority of sign-ins are successful, which is a great sign. Some of them are pending user input. That's okay if it's not too many, but you do probably want to watch for any big spikes in the trend line here, which we don't have. Failures are also okay if the number is small. Some of those are going to be legitimate where the user was unable to comply with the conditional access policy and shouldn't have been able to access a resource. But it's another thing that you want to keep track of to make sure there aren't any big anomalous spikes. And one of the most important things about workbooks is you can see this all at a glance. This information is already there in the reports that Sarah has shown you, but it's much easier to consume and to watch for patterns in this workbook mile-high view. So let's click into this pending user action view. And you can see down here that the whole workbook is actually updating now so that it just shows the pending user action users. As we look here, we see that because this is a Microsoft test tenant, unsurprisingly, most of the usage does come from the US. You can click here to see that, again, unsurprisingly, there's a lot of usage from Seattle and Redmond and Bellevue, which are all around Microsoft's headquarters. If you want to search for a specific location, so example, I'm going to search for Bangalore or Bengaluru, you can search that here and see what your users from any specific location are doing. You can also take a tour of sign-ins by device. So we can see, once again, it's not very surprising that most of our Microsoft test users are using Windows 10. Some of them are using Mac OS. And of course, this pattern will vary a bit based on your company and what kind of devices you have deployed. If you want to see more information about the user agents these users are actually using to access your resources, you can click into that here. And for each of these queries, it's important to note that you can see more details in log analytics just by clicking on the query. So here you can see what the query is, and that's going to be very, very useful as you're learning more about workbooks and becoming more proficient with them. You can copy these queries, learn from them, and eventually clone and edit the workbooks so that you can make the queries work really well for your organization's specific needs. So in addition to the sign-ins report, another really interesting and useful report is this conditional access insights and reporting workbook. So conditional access is a powerful tool for enforcing least privilege. You should definitely have a strong, thoughtful set of policies that protect your users, apps, and your corporate data. Some common conditional access policies include requiring MFA for users, stopping risky users or risky sign-ins, blocking certain less secure types of authentication, such as legacy authentication, or maybe blocking devices that aren't in a safe state. You can also use conditional access for things like enforcing that only users that should have access to an app for licensing or privacy reasons are able to access that app. So conditional access is very powerful and useful. It can also be risky, however, because you can lock legitimate users out of their apps, and you can even lock yourself out if you're not careful. So to make sure that you don't cause end user satisfaction issues as you protect apps and users, it's really good to keep an eye on what your conditional access policies are doing. This report lets you do that. So let's begin with these filters at the top of the report. They look similar to but there are a couple that are unique. I'm going to set the time range filter here for the last 30 days so we can see a little bit more data. That runs pretty fast on our test tenant, but may run a little bit slower for those of you with hundreds of thousands of users. Most of these filters are pretty familiar, but the conditional access filter and the data view filter are new. The conditional access policy filter lets you see the effect of a certain policy or set of policies, while the data view filter lets you switch between seeing users or sign-ins. So obviously there are more sign-ins than users because every user will generate multiple sign-ins as they come back to your tenant again and again. The conditional access policy filter here lets you see the effect of a certain policy or a set of policies. You can get a good sense of everything that's happening in your tenant and watch for major issues by selecting all enabled policies, which is the default view. This shows you the policies that are actually in place and affecting your users. So if you see large amounts of failure or not applied, that can be a concern in a real production tenant. You can see in what scenarios that would be applied before you start using it to make sure that you avoid any unwanted effects. So here we can also dive into individual policies. So you can look at just the effect of one policy or another. So I'm going to click here on Allow Workbook Demo Users, which is a policy I created specifically for this demo. And I can see that the policy is blocking some users and allowing other users. And I can also look at the individual effects of report-only policies. So I set up a policy to block some users here as well, and I can see the policy is doing that as designed. So this is a great way for you to just make sure that all your policies are having the intended effects. I'm going to go back to all enabled policies here. And let's take a look at these impact summary boxes, which show you what is happening. The explanation for each of these boxes is as follows. The total box shows you the number of users or sign-ins from this period. it's everybody or all the sign-ins, whether they were covered by conditional access or not. Success is all the users and sign-ins for which a conditional access policy ran and was successful or let the user log in. And failure is all of the users and sign-ins for which a conditional access policy ran, but the user was not able to log in. So they may have been legitimately blocked because it wasn't a safe login, or it may have been an accident where the user shouldn't have been blocked. Not applied means that there wasn't a conditional access policy, or the conditional access policy and scope wasn't applied to that user. So let's click on not applied because we might be interested in what kind of users we're not applying conditional access policies to. Now, one of the really great things about this report is you can see here all of the conditions that you can set conditional access policies on. So for example, device platform is one of the conditions that you can set a conditional access policy on, and you can see that here. So for example, if Windows 10 was a set of a device platform that you didn't have a policy yet for, you would see a lot of Windows 10 users here. If you need to dive into the specifics of a specific user, you can go way to the bottom of the report. And for example, I'll take a look at Leslie here to see Leslie's sign-ins. And you can see all of the different app display names, all of the different resources that Leslie is accessing, as well as whether the conditional access policy that you have in scope was applied, not applied, or a success or a failure. All right, so let's take a look at one more very useful report, which is the sign-in failure analysis. If you need to troubleshoot sign-ins across your organization, this report is very useful. The sign-in logs themselves, which Sarah has already shown, can be really helpful in cases where you are resolving a specific complaint for a user. But from the sign-in view, it's a little hard to tell what the patterns are overall for your entire tenant. This workbook, on the other hand, gives you a really high, nice level view for seeing what the general success and failure rate across your tenant is and whether there have been any unexpected bumps to those rates. So the filters in this report are pretty familiar to what we've been looking at already. You can, again, change the time range, which apps you're looking at or which users you're looking at. And then these boxes here give you a good understanding of the sign-in health of your tenant. We see that for the most part, users are successfully able to log into the tenant, which is what we would expect and what we want to see. And then we also see that there are some users who have failed to log in, as well as some users that are pending user action. So down below, the summary of top errors is very useful. And the reason for this is, again, if you're looking at the sign-in reports themselves, it can be a little hard to tell what are the most impactful errors that might be blocking your users or causing user satisfaction issues. But if you come to this view, you can easily see that solving some of these top issues is going to have a bigger impact than solving these smaller issues. So let's take a look at one of these issues to see how we might solve it. I'm going to click on this external security challenge was not satisfied. And once I click on this row, I can see populated here all of the users that have hit this issue. If I click on the error code, it will pop up details similar to the sign-in report about what exactly happened in the sign-in. So I can see the user, I can see the description, a lot of details here on the conditional access policy. And if all of this still seems a little opaque, another thing I can do is copy this error code and go to login.microsoftonline.com/error and then paste this code in. So as I do that, I get a much more detailed description of what the error was. And so here I can see that the external security challenge was not satisfied. And what that means in this sense is that I configured a conditional access block this user from accessing that resource until the user had agreed to a terms of service document. And so as this user, I was blocked from signing in. Azure AD redirected me to the terms of service. I agreed to it and then was able to access the resource. So following that pattern, you can figure out what is happening to these users and why they're getting the error codes that they're getting. If you return back here to the sign-in failure report and go down past the error codes, you can also see a summary of sign-ins waiting on user action. Similar to the error codes, you can click on a row here. You can see the keep me sign in interrupt, which is that little box that pops up and asks if a user wants to say signed in. And again, you can click on the details here to see details about the sign-in, when it happened, what the error code was, the description, and then all the conditional access policies that were applied to this sign-in. That's it for our tour of Workbooks. Again, we'd recommend that you begin with Workbooks by taking a look at the default workbooks that we've provided for you in the Azure AD portal. Once you're comfortable with those workbooks, you can begin adapting them for your specific needs by opening up the queries and seeing how those queries work. And you can clone the workbooks, edit the workbooks. As you become very proficient with them, you can share them throughout your organization to help your help desk staff or other admins solve the common problems that they have with identity and access management. And of course, if you become very proficient with workbooks, we would welcome you to contribute to the community by giving your own workbooks to our GitHub. So that's it for workbooks. Thanks, everyone. That wraps up our Azure AD reporting and log talk that we're giving today. We hope that you learned a lot. Overall, we'd encourage you to begin by taking a look at the logs within the Azure portal UI. That's an easy and quick way to get started getting familiar with these logs. As you learn more, you can begin writing your own queries. You can integrate with log analytics to get a little more detail on what you can do with these logs. And of course, if you have a SIEM or would like to do more advanced monitoring within Azure Monitor, we'd encourage you to do that as well. On behalf of Sarah and myself, thank you again for coming. We hope that you've learned a lot, and please let us know your questions on workbooks and your suggestions for feature improvements. We're hoping to hear from you.